to approach a close study of T.S. Eliot without losing your mind. All right, the first thing we need to do is not panic. T.S. Eliot is a very esoteric poet. He was a very erudite man who was extremely well educated, and he did write poetry for people who were extremely well educated, and there is an expectation, if you are going to unpack his poetry, that you come armed with a lot of information. But at the same time, poems are just words. Words cannot help us, and our best defense against words is other words. So what I want you to think about is the fact that you already know a lot of the words you need in order to unpack T.S. Eliot's poetry. I'm going to introduce you to some new words that you may not have known about, and I'm also going to talk about the way we are going to think about T.S. Eliot's poetry so that we can unpack these 5 poems for Module B and get through the HSC without losing our minds. So, are we ready? The first thing I'd like you to understand is that T.S. Eliot was an Imagist poet. Now, an Imagist poet, as it says here, he was part of a movement which included both English and American poets, and that's interesting because he was both English and American. He started off in Missouri but then became English later on in his career. And they were writing in the early 20th century, particularly after the First World War, when a great deal of things had happened to Western society and things had changed. Now, the whole point of Imagist poetry is they were devoted to clarity of expression through the use of precise visual images. That's very true of T.S. Eliot, but T.S. Eliot goes beyond the visual images. He also sought to use all of our senses. He captures images orally and in terms of smell, so olfactorily, gustatorily, taste, and finally tactilely. There's a lot of tactile images there. So when you are reading T.S. Eliot's poetry, remember that there's a lot of imagery in there, and it is key to unpacking the poetry is unpacking the imagery. Now, the whole point of these images is they are images which link us to the concrete world. Our senses link us to the concrete world. And using these images, which are often quite concrete, T.S. Eliot seeks to explore very, very abstract ideas which are difficult to capture and convey through language. So the 2 things you really need to know is you need to look at the imagery and you need to think about, well, how does this symbolize? How does this represent something else, something broader, something more abstract? And what is the poet trying to convey about those ideas? So when you first look at T.S. Eliot's poetry, you will discover that it looks a little bit like this. This here is a magic eye picture. It's a stereographic image, which, if you know how to look at correctly, will reveal something else. So what you see here is just a whole mishmash of little pictures, which don't really create a cohesive whole. But if you learn to look at it properly, and it actually involves unfocusing your eyes, you will capture the stereo image and you'll actually find a 3D image embedded in there. So there's actually a 3D image taking up most of the picture of a witch reaching forward at the viewer. Now, some people can see these images easily, some people struggle to, some people never get the hang of it. And T.S. Eliot's poetry is a little bit like that. But with a few tricks of the trade, you should learn to be able to unpack T.S. Eliot's poetry and find out what it is that he's trying to convey. The other image on the right-hand side is another way of looking at Imagist poetry. So when you look at this particular picture, most people first of all see 2 elderly people, an elderly couple staring into each other's eyes. But if you look closer, you'll discover that also in the image are a couple of Mexicans, one male, one female, one playing the guitar, one holding a what looks like a terracotta pot on its head. You look again and you will see that the man's ear is actually a woman standing in a doorway. You look again and you will discover that there's actually a goblet in the middle of between the two, created by the outlines of their faces. So Imagist poetry is very much like that. It's like an optical illusion, where every time you look at it, you're going to see something slightly different. And the message is then, you should not read T.S. Eliot's poetry once. You read a poem, you may not see anything. You may see like the stereo image on the left. You read it again, you read it again, you read it again. You keep on reading it over and over again until you can almost recite it, and you'll discover that slowly but surely you will begin to unpack different images, different ways of looking at it which will convey different meanings. So the likelihood is that you'll never look at the poem and see the same thing twice. But you will find recurring ideas. And the more you read the poems, the more often you read the poems, the better you are equipped to unpack them. So, moving on. Here's a term that you may not be familiar with. It is the objective correlative. T.S. Eliot was very interested in the objective correlative. This is all part of his connection with the New Critics movement, a new way of looking at poetry and literature in general. Now, new objective correlative is just really a fancy way of saying showing, not telling, which is not a new concept, hopefully, to you. You would have seen that scribbled all over your creative writing constantly. So, objective correlative. The point of the objective correlative is you take concrete images, something, some sort of imagery, and then you give it a symbolic significance. And the symbolism, which is then evoked by these recurring images, effectively draws the reader or the responder into the poem and shows them the ideas that are being conveyed. It doesn't tell you anything directly, it doesn't tell you anything for certain, but it gives you a sense, and you need to follow those senses and see what you can unpack. So the point is that T.S. Eliot never makes it easy for you. He's never going to say in a poem, this is a poem about a man who is very sad. He will show you how sad this man is. He will show you the depth of this man's sadness. He'll show you some of the reasons for this man's sadness, but he'll never talk about it directly. You have to work. So the point of the objective correlative means that when you approach T.S. Eliot's poetry, you must do so as an active reader. You cannot sit there and wait for him to spoon feed you. You must think laterally, and you must infer from what is symbolized by the various images. And sometimes it takes a bit of practice to do that. And that's fine. That's what you're here to learn to do. So I'm going to read this to you because it is very important. Images poems draw the responder into the world of the persona through multi-layered and highly symbolic yet concrete images in an effort to communicate complex, abstract ideas and emotions. The language is carefully edited and nothing extraneous is included, and as a result, everything about the poem impacts the meaning, from the poetic techniques, the syntax, the words, meter, right down to the punctuation. You need to pay attention to it all. And that is important. The thing is, what you're drawing from these poems is not a little tale, a little sort of moral, like you should always be nice to your mother, or pride comes before a fall. You can't take the meaning of a T.S. Eliot poem and boil it down to something that banal. But you can articulate more or less what it is that he's trying to convey, and you need to do so. In your mind that what he's trying to convey is very abstract. It's a truth that's extremely slippery. It's something which is difficult to communicate. And that's the whole point of poetry. The poetry is trying to take these ephemeral emotions and feelings and things which are very difficult to put into words and put them into words. And to do so requires a great deal of symbolism. Okay, so pay attention to everything. All right, now we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of this poetry. There are a number of techniques which he uses. His poetry is extremely dense. It's technique dense. You could spend an entire essay just looking at the first stanza of a poem and still not unpack all the techniques being used. But there are some big ticket items which you need to look for, and those big ticket items are the ones that you want to be writing about in your essays. So the first one is allusion. So allusion is a reference to something that's come previous or previously. So as I said before, T.S. Eliot was an extremely erudite poet. He was very, very well educated in the extreme. And there is an expectation that the people who are going to appreciate his poetry are also going to be that educated. So he makes allusions to all kinds of literature that's become before. Now, specifically in the poems that you're going to look at, he makes allusions to Shakespeare, to Hamlet in particular, to Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy, which was this epic poem written at the end of the 12th century by an Italian Florentine. Of course, he was an Italian Florentine by Florentine. And he also makes reference to the Bible. He makes reference to Guy Fawkes Night, which is a tradition in England where they remember the attempt to blow up Parliament by Guy Fawkes and his followers. He makes reference to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and the Mr. Kurtz. He dead. So you need to understand what all of these references mean. You can't ignore them. You'll find at the beginning of J. Alfred Prufrock, the first stanza is written in Latin. And a lot of students make the mistake of looking and they go, oh, I can't read Latin, so I'm just going to ignore it and carry on and see what I can do. Problem is that if you don't unpack that allusion, you can't understand what the rest of the poem is about, because that allusion actually directs you to a way of thinking, which is in line with the way that J. Alfred Prufrock is thinking. So you have to unpack that allusion. So my hot tip is, when you come across an allusion like that, find out what it is, find out what it means, where it comes from, and some of the meaning which is involved, which is packed into that allusion. We will help you in the process. We will unpack them. We'll give you translations. But really, you need to do these things yourself. Now, unlike T.S. Eliot had a tremendous brain. You've got Google. If you come across a reference which you don't understand, then Google it. Find out. Find out about Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. Read as much as you can and you will be better off. Okay. So, another technique, symbols and motifs. Symbolism is extremely important in T.S. Eliot's poetry. He is an imagist poet, and therefore the imagery is meant symbolically. So sometimes he is, on one level, describing something which is quite literal. He talks about grimy scraps and gusty showers and that whole unpleasantness of the weather in England at times. And that's meant literally. But it's also at the very same time meant symbolically as well. And the tip is here, if you come across an image which seems odd, something that you just can't quite get your head around, then it probably is very symbolic. And it's probably something that you need to think about. And here is an example of one. This comes from Rhapsody on a Windy Night, and it's one of my favourite images of all time. And it says, "Midnight shakes the memory as a madman shakes a dead geranium," which is a rather strange image if you think about it. Now, what I want you to do is to imagine this crazy person. This crazy person's got this potted plant which has died, and this crazy person's probably a bit upset about his potted plant dying, but rather than doing anything useful with it, he shakes it. He shakes it and shakes it and shakes it. Because a dead potted plant is kind of brittle, it starts to fragment, it falls apart, there's dirt going everywhere, there's bits coming off, it's making an unholy mess. And at the end of the day, the entire thing that's been done, the process, the whole reason for doing it is pointless. It's futile. It doesn't improve the situation at all. It just makes it worse. Thought about like that. Midnight, so a time of day when really the persona should probably be asleep. He's not. He's awake. He's awake at midnight. And at midnight, he finds his memory being shaken like a madman shaking a dead geranium. And you can imagine this brittle memory, all these bits breaking away, the memory fragmenting and becoming more and more disintegrated, bits going everywhere, a mess occurring, and ultimately the process is so destructive, it is utterly pointless. It doesn't make things any better. And that's how midnight shakes his memory. So can you see? There's a hell of a lot of meaning just in that one little image, which you can pull out, and you can get to see the despair being discussed by the persona here. He's showing you just how despairing he is, and how frustrated and lost and fragmented and damaged he's becoming as the poem progresses. So if you come across something, an image you don't understand, think as laterally as you can. Try to visualize the picture and then go from there. Extrapolate. What could this mean? How could the other thing be like that? And you'll find a great deal of meaning. The next thing you need to be aware of is motifs. Motifs are recurring images. Now, motifs are very important in T.S. Eliot's poetry because being aware of them, you will also be able to trace them and their use through the variety of poems that you are reading. even though the 5 poems we're studying, they were written, I think the first one is 1917 when it was written. The latest one, which is Journey the Magi, was written in the late 20s. So you've got about a decade. And a lot of things changed for T.S. Eliot in that time, and his focus changed as well. But you still find these similar motifs and themes running through. And that's extremely important for identifying textual integrity. How does this body of work hang together as a whole? Where are some of the recurring ideas? How does one inform the other? And through the motifs is one of the ways you're going to find that, because the motifs also lead us to theme. So let's have a look at some of these motifs. Time and aging is a really important one. T.S. Eliot constantly captures this idea of the relentless progression of time. Time just keeps going forward constantly. Time, it doesn't stop. It doesn't matter what happens to us. It just keeps on marching forward, and we have no way of controlling it. And he makes references to time he actually tells you the time: midnight, 1 a.m., 3 a.m. It's 6 o'clock with the lighting of the lamps. He'll talk about winter and summer. He'll talk about the change from evening to morning and then back to evening again, and this relentless time and time again. He'll also talk about aging, getting old, bald patches in his hair, and hasn't his arms grown thin, and oh, I grow old, says one of his personas. So that aging and time and the progression of time is very important. Decay and detritus is another one. You remember that he is writing in this period after the First World War, and there is this sense that he generates that the glory days are over. What society's like now, it's like the party the day after, where there's nothing left except for the bits and pieces left over from the party. So there's this concept, there's these withered leaves and grimy scraps and broken chimney pots and soot and ash and all the bits that are left over after the effect. So look at that decay and detritus, and it is capturing a mood. It's capturing an idea about that particular period of history when it felt like everything was broken, everything was over, the good times were past, and now we're on a downhill slide. So look out for that. Vacancy and emptiness is another one, also linked with this. So women collecting fuel in vacant lots, the vacant stairs. The moon that's lost its memory, there's nothing there. This emptiness, this meaninglessness of modern existence, which he captures quite well, and he does so all the way through all of his poems. So if you think about the hollow man, what does it mean to be hollow, to have nothing, this nothingness? And it's all about the nothingness and how it torments us. Smoke and ash, again, links in with detritus and decay. Fog and mist and smoke and ash also together, the obscuring of the way we see things. We can't see because there's a mist in front of us. We can't quite penetrate it. And he often gives the fog, for instance, animalistic qualities. So in Prufrock, he talks about the fog as if it's a cat. And if you think about cats, the difference between cats and dogs have owners, cats have staff. They tend to do their thing without really worrying about anybody else. They're forces of nature which don't care. They'll do their thing, and you can love it or lump it. It's up to you. And the fog is like that. It's this relentless force of nature, and it also moves like a cat as well, which is a wonderful image. Celestial body is another one. He's constantly talking about stars. He talks about the stars in Rhapsody, the stars and the moon is the other one. So he talks about the moon in the Rhapsody on a Windy Night, this moon which is sort of looking, and it's lost its memory. It's as if it's there. I mean, the moon itself is so symbolic, but it's lost its memory. So why is it lost its memory? Why is it's now finding everything meaningless? It's confusing. But it's also cold and it's remote, and it probably doesn't care, even though it watches our every move. He makes lots of references to stars in the Hollow Men, these stars which are sort of watching us from a distance, completely unmoved by our suffering, and captures that idea about celestial bodies in that respect. And unanswered questions is another big one. He is constantly trying to get hold of that slippery truth, the slipperiness of these ephemeral ideas that he's trying to capture. And he's questioning, he's asking, the answer's never there. He doesn't quite get there. They're always unanswered questions. And there's a frustration that builds from that repetition of these unanswered questions that just don't go anywhere. Hands, feet, and eyes. He often talks about human beings in terms of their parts. He doesn't talk about them as integrated individuals, integrated wholes. He talks about them as bits. So their feet move to coffee stands and their hands pull down blinds. He focuses on their eyes, but never the holistic person. And that's very important because of this whole fragmentation of modern existence. Moving on. Okay, figurative language and imagery, also very important because figurative language and imagery is his stock and trade. All of these techniques, though, you are familiar with. You have seen them before. We've studied them in Shakespeare. We've studied them in other poetry. So personification. The morning comes to consciousness. So the morning is not a human being, therefore it cannot wake up. But it comes to consciousness. He personifies morning, which gives it this human quality. So this passage of time has got a human quality. It's all about the perception of the passage of time, and at the same time, morning becomes like synecdoche. It's a technique of synecdoche where morning represents an aspect of the human being. We all have these mornings, and we come, and in the morning we wake up, and in the evening we go to sleep, and then in the morning we wake up, and in the evening we go to sleep. There's repetition. So all caught there in the personification. Hyperbole is used a great deal, especially in proof rock. Keep an eye out for hyperbole in proof rock. Also in Rhapsody on a Windy Night. The do I dare disturb the universe? It's so hyperbolic, it's quite ironic, because we see this character, this persona as J. Alfred Prufrock is this rather prissy, pointless little man who has measured out his life in coffee spoons. He spends his entire time poncing around with all of these erudite individuals talking about Michelangelo, and yet he can't make up his mind whether he wants to ask this question. And he's seeing himself as this minute, insignificant little speck in infinite reality, and yet he's overthought his problems to the point where it seems that if he doesn't make his decision, or if he does make his decision, he could disturb the universe, which is, of course, ridiculous because he's so insignificant. So this really shows us what's going on inside this man's head, the contradictions, the paradox, and it's all communicated through that hyperbole. Similes. Don't discount the similes. Lots of similes in there. And you see the corner of her eye twists like a crooked pin. Now, you could take that literally. Maybe she's got a bit of a squint. Maybe she's a bit, a bit twitchy, she could be slightly deformed. But at the same time, the eye, what does the eye represent? The eye is how we look at the world. It's our means of perceiving our visual reality, and it's twisted like a crooked pin. So her perception has become twisted and deformed and corrupt. And, it does lead to ask the question, well, what's happened to this woman to make this happen to her? And finally, with the metaphor, the yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, which I've talked about before. This wonderful image of these forces of nature, which, just like a cat, we have no real control over. We like it. We'll let it into our lives. We seem to think that we're controlling it, but really, it does what it wants. So think about all of those techniques. The next thing is aural techniques. Because he is an imagist poet, he's not just creating visual imagery. He uses a lot of aural imagery, appealing to our sense of hearing. So you think about the onomatopoeia. In preludes where the lamps are muttering and spluttering, and you get that sense of that flickering flame and the sound of the gas jets as it feeds the lamp. He uses assonance to capture the shape in an aural way and the movement of things. So the yellow smoke, so that long O sound which moves in the same way, really, as a cat moves. It's got that sinuousness to it, that roundness. The cat moves like yellow smoke. So he's not just evoking the image of a cat, the yellow smoke looking like a cat, but it also, the way it sounds like the movement of a cat. So he's capturing it on multiple levels. Alliteration, consonants, and sibilants are really important. The lonely cab horse steams and stamps. He often he alliterates on the plosives like P's and T's and S. And it gives you that sense of the staccato, slightly unsyncopated rhythm of our world. It's jarring points that are going on around us, and it is jarring, and it makes us sort of stop. Rhyme. He'll often throw rhyme in for no apparent reason. It's divisions and precision. So with J. Alfred Prufrock, as he becomes more hysterical, he starts to rhyme more, and you can see it. It's slightly silly, but it really is capturing what's going on inside this man's head. Okay, and don't discount the metre. He was extremely conscious of metre, and if you read his poetry in Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, which is the poetry he wrote for children, he had a tremendous ear for rhythm, the rhythm of language, and his metre is impeccable. And also his rhyming schemes, just so beautifully done. There's not a wrenched metre in there. There's not a wrenched rhyme either. So more often than not, he will slip in, and it seems like it's happened accidentally, into iambic pentameter or as some sort of anapaestic rhythm, and then it'll just suddenly stop or jar. And it gives you that sense that, something's happened. We've come to a halt, or we've become out of sync. And that in sync, out of sync movement helps us understand about, what it feels like to be in the modern world, where sometimes everything's going along, chugging along, suddenly it screeches to a halt, we're out of sync again, and we become confused and disoriented. He was also terribly, terribly droll, terribly, terribly funny. His friends probably thought he was just such a card. He puts little puns in. So there's a metrical pun here at the bottom of the page. His soul stretched tight across the skies that fade behind a city block or trampled by insistent feet. Now, feet are the two things on the end of your legs, which you walk with and you trample, but feet are also the building blocks of metre. So a metrical foot is either 2 or 3 syllables with stresses in various places. So an iambic metrical foot is 2 syllables with the stress on the second syllable. And he's written these lines in this iambic metre, and it's as if he's saying his soul is being trampled by the insistent feet of poetry. The poetry of life is trampling this man's soul. So there is those sorts of puns working in there. And he does that a lot. So keep an eye out for it. All right, think about how he creates tone and mood. Tone and mood is extremely important because he's often talking about emotions and other abstract ideas. So in the emotive language plot here, if you look here, these are all from preludes. I just pulled out all the emotive words. So you've got burnt out, stale, stretched, gusty, trampled, fade, grimy, muddy, short, withered, dingy, blackened, broken, sordid, impatient, lonely, soiled, suffering, and vacant. And all of those words are in there to create that mood, the mood of it's broken, and it's slightly depressing, and it's the leftovers, and it's dark, and it's certainly uninspiring. And he is capturing that mood of what it's like in all these furnished rooms throughout London, where all these individuals are living in their isolated hell, but their isolated hell is a shared collective misery common to them all. So keep an eye out for the emotive language. Dialogue is another technique he uses. He likes to throw in just a bit of dialogue out of the blue. Sometimes it's imagined dialogue, sometimes it's remembered dialogue, sometimes it's actual dialogue. And often the dialogue will express something, a certain frustration in the inability to communicate. So that is not it at all. That is not what I meant at all. And it does point to the ineffectualness of language as a way of communicating, because we have all these emotions, these feelings, these ideas that we need to get across. We need people to understand, and yet our ability to do so is so inhibited by the lack of ability to do so through language. Language is just insufficient to express it. And you'll find that as part of the modernist movement, there was an enormous explosion in very abstract art. These abstract ways of showing the fragmentation and the frustration and the feelings without actually painting a real thing. So again, that the need to communicate is very much there. Okay, rhetoric is another one. He uses a lot of rhetorical devices. Rhetorical questions are used constantly. People asking, these questions, how should I presume? Questions that don't have answers, questions that don't necessarily lead us anywhere, but they lead us to a way of thinking, which is what he wants to do. He uses pathos extensively. A lot of the images that he creates, especially of human beings, are pathetic. They are these gentle infant, these suffering things, these humans. And you see people like personas like J. Alfred Prufrock saying things like, I grow old, I shall wear my trousers rolled. Pathetic image. And he builds that pathos that we feel sorry for him even as much as we write him off. Personas make direct appeals. Not just in J. Alfred Prufrock, where he says, oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In other ones, there are appeals being made, like the Hollow Men. The Hollow Men themselves are making appeals, but they fall on deaf ears because the Hollow Men are essentially in hell. He makes interjections. No, I am not Prince Hamlet. No, or oh, or yes. All these sort of sudden emotive interjections just come out. They're the ways that we express this frustration and this. I have this urgency. I must express it to you with an exclamation mark because it's so urgent, and yet it is just so insufficient to express what I want to say. And never discount the punctuation. T.S. Eliot was once quoted saying when he was he was looking at somebody else's poem, he was critiquing another poem, and he said, there's something about the punctuation just so dreadfully sad. He saw meaning everywhere, and he uses punctuation to place that meaning. Look particularly for ellipsis, the ... these fragmented sentences, these phrases, these clauses which don't have everything they need in order to be coherent, and how that represents and symbolises the fragmentation of thought processes which we go through, the fragmentation of our lives, the fragmentation of information. Everything is broken and it's not being coherent anymore. Moving on, parody and irony. Keep a close eye on parody and irony. He often parodies the poetic styles of other writers. He was extremely well read. He knew, he read everything Shakespeare wrote multiple times, even though he didn't like it. And he parodies other writers. He had read all the Romantics. He knew what they wrote like. He'd read all the Victorian sentimental writing. He knew what he was dealing with, and he knew what he was making fun of as well, and he knew what he liked. So often, for instance, he mocks pastoral poetry, and he replicates it in this parodic way in preludes, where instead of the beautiful, healing, natural world that pastoral poetry encounters, he's using the same techniques, but he does so in the urban environment, and it's the opposite effect. So what you find in the urban environment is pain and suffering. So keep an eye out for that. He often does things ironically. He says, J. Alfred Prufrock says, no, I am not Prince Hamlet, meaning the hero. But in a lot of ways, he is just like Hamlet. He can't make a simple decision. And that was the downfall of Hamlet. He couldn't make the decisions he needed to make. He was completely indecisive. And J. Alfred Prufrock just like that. So his comment that I'm not Prince Hamlet is ironic. Keep an eye out from being playful, using double meanings, puns, wordplays, connotations, homophones. For instance, he often links the word soul, S-O-U-L, with soul, S-O-L-E, one being the immortal part of ourselves, the other being the bottom part of our foot. And he does so cleverly to show that, there's not much difference between the immortal part of ourselves and the bottom of our foot. Both are essential to us, and both are treated very badly. So think about those sorts of things. Look for shifts in verb tense. Often he expresses the relentless passage of time through changes into, past, present, and future. Look for the shifts between passive and active voice. Sometimes he writes entire stanzas where there is no subject. There's no subject at all. It's just these actions which are happening. But then all of a sudden it'll shift into active voice, and you have got a subject who is the recipient or the actor behind these behaviours, and look at the effect that has. Look at shifts between first, second and third person narration. He often wants to show us things from different points of view, especially when he's trying to show a collective experience of humanity, which is experienced, though, in isolation. So look for those as well. And finally, keep your eye on the big picture. This entire unit, Module B, is about textual integrity. Okay, so what you don't want to do is see T.S. Eliot's poetry as a bunch of techniques just linked together like a string of pearls. You need to find that integrated message. You want to find the through lines of meaning and articulate for yourself, not using other people's words, but your words, what is being communicated to you. And then you can talk about how it was communicated to you, and look for the continuity of ideas through the poems, even though they were written between 1917 and 1926. And enjoy it as well, because there are some brilliant ideas in here. There's some huge ideas, massive ideas, things that are relevant to you, even though you're not T.S. Eliot, you are a teenage girl living in modern Australia. It doesn't make any difference. A lot of things that she has to talk about are still relevant in our world, and they're still difficult to express. So look for those, and you will find a great deal of meaning, and please enjoy it, because poetry rocks. And finally, just to end off, I shall give you a picture of a cat. T.S. Eliot loved cats. I want you to go out there and read Old Possum's book of practical cats, if for no other reasons than it's a lot of fun. Thank you very much. Goodbye.